In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how I crochet front post extended single crochet stitches. Now, the principles that I'm going to show you can be used with any types of post stitches, but I'm using extended single crochet, that's US terms, because it's not commonly used, and also because I've used this technique in a couple of new patterns, which I'll link in the comments. Here I have a row of extended single crochet. The thing to notice about these extended stitches is they can be quite top heavy because the first part of the stitch is essentially a chain and then you work the normal stitch on top of that. They can get a bit squashed down, and as I work this you'll see what I mean, but I just wanted to mention that up front. I do have a separate tutorial for the extended single crochet stitch, so I won't repeat that here, but I will link to it. Similarly, I have tutorials for front and back post stitches. So in this demonstration, I am going to chain 2 as my turning chain. So in this first row, I chained 9, and then starting in the third chain from hook, I worked 7 extended single crochets. So that's what I've got here. You can see here, that is the top of my first stitch. Now, when you're working in rows of post stitches, it may seem like I'm labouring an obvious point here, but actually it's one of those things that can catch you out. Whenever you're working around the post of the stitch, and this here is the post of the stitch, you're essentially working underneath 2 tops. So you're putting your hook from front to back and then back to front. So you're looping round those 2 tops rather than just working under the top V's. The reason this is important is because it's going to make it really key for you to know where you're placing your stitches. So if we look at the end of this row, this stitch here, that is the top of the last stitch from the previous row. If I turn it round, so as you work in rows, the top of the stitch here is just before the post of the stitch. So you can see this is the post and this is the top. And when you turn it round, the top of the stitch is just after the post of the stitch. When you're working with post stitches in rows, there's a couple of ways you can make sure you get quite neat edges. The first is to work a typical stitch into the top of that first stitch. So here is the last stitch from the previous row. So I'm working extended single crochet. So if I wanted a kind of border, a buffer around the edge, which is what I've done in my tutorial where I show you different rib stitches using post stitches. So you always want to work a slightly shorter stitch when you're working stitches next to post stitches, because the post stitches will shrink down. So instead of working an extended single crochet, I might work a single crochet in that first stitch and then work around the post of that stitch to start my post stitch row. But that will give me a kind of little buffer around the edge. Now in this demonstration, I don't want that little buffer. I want post stitches all of the way across. And looking at this, the obvious way to do it might be to start by working around this post stitch here. And that is the post of the last stitch from the previous row. Now what I'm going to do is something that might not seem obvious. Instead of working around this first post stitch here, I'm going to work around the second. So I go under the top of that first stitch and then under the top of the second stitch. So I'm pulling that post towards me. So I'm going to yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through 1, yarn over and pull through 2. So that is my first post stitch. The turning chain is not counted as a stitch here, but it is kind of key. So I've worked my first post stitch around the second post. I've essentially skipped that first stitch here. So I'm going to work my second post stitch around this next one, and you will find with these stitches that when you pull, you're going to get the stitch pulling up like that, which is fine because what we want to do is to push the top of those stitches away from us so they create that little rib. So that's 2. Then the next one, between the top of that stitch and the top of the next stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 1, yarn over, pull through 2. So that's 3. I'm going to carry on across 4, 5. This is what I was saying about the stitches getting a bit squashed. So this is where I'll start from the train, but you can see sometimes the kind of post of the stitch almost pokes through. So if that happens, you can just pull the top of the stitch up. This is something that's particular to extended single crochets generally. So this is stitch number 6. I've got one more stitch to work, and this is the top of that stitch. So that's the top of the first stitch from the previous row. So I'm going to work under that top, and I'm going to work into my turning chain. So I'm still getting that post stitch and I'm still pushing the top of that stitch forward. It just seems a bit different. So I'll show you that again. So I've turned and I've chained 2. So that's 1 chain, 2 chain. This is the top of that last stitch. I could work around the post of this stitch here, and there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. In fact, I'll show you. But what I find, so if I work that as my first stitch, that as my second stitch, I find you get this kind of excess gap here, and I just don't like it. Like, there's nothing wrong with it, it's totally a personal choice, but this is the way I've found works best. So I'll show you that all again. So this here is the top of that last stitch. So I'm going to go under that top and then under the second top, which means I'm working around the second post. So pull up a loop and yarn over, pull through 1, and yarn over, pull through 2. Then the next one, I'm going to work around the second post, and I'm going to go under the top of the second and the top of the third. Yarn over, pull up a loop, pull through 1, yarn over, pull through 2. Then for the third stitch, I'm going to go through the top of under the top of the third and back under the top of the fourth and round the fourth post. And then I'm going to carry on. So this is number 1, 2, that's 4 stitches, 5. So that's the 5th stitch, which is work round the 6th post, and then the 6th stitch, which is work around the 7th post, and then that last stitch I'm going to work under the top of the 7th stitch and into my turning chain. So you can see I've gone under those 2 loops into the turning chain, and then I'm going to do my stitch there. If I chain and turn, you can see it's just got quite a nice sort of neater edge. So I'll do a couple more rows so you can see the kind of overall effect. So that's the 6th post again, the 7th and last stitch. I'm going to go under that top, and you've got this little leg there and the next little leg there, and I just find working into those gives you this sort of stability at the edge. It's quite hard to see in such a small swatch, but it really does end up with a nicer edge, I think. One of the reasons that so that's again my last stitch. One of the reasons that I start the first post between the first and second stitches is because when I was swatching, if you work, say, one row of front post stitches and then the next row of just normal stitches, if you work in that first stitch there, you're going to find that your swatch goes a bit wonky. So I just find this method, although it might seem a bit backwards, is a bit more robust for when you're working with different stitches. Last one there. So the last thing I want to show you, just quickly, is what happens when you change colour. So I finished that row and I'm just gonna chain 2 with this bright pink. If you ever wonder how a stitch is kind of constructed, like changing colours and between rows is a really useful way to see what part of the stitch goes where. So I'm going to carry on there as I have been before. I'm just going to work my post stitches there. And then my last stitch goes under that top and into those 2 legs by the chain. So if I turn this round, you can quite clearly see how these light pink parts, that's the top of the previous row that have been pushed forwards, and you can see that the dark pink just about underneath. I just think that's a really nice feature. If I changed it back and changed colour each row, it would almost have a kind of brioche type effect, which frankly now I want to go and experiment with. So I hope you found that useful. Any questions or comments, just drop it below, as well as links to all the other associated tutorials. You'll find all that in the description. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for tons more tutorials and crochet goodness.